Everyone, welcome to the next episode of CS Cyber. I'm Sean.
And I'm Chad.
And that's the CS piece. Today, we're going to tackle another one of the most common questions that we get, vulnerability scanning versus pen testing. I get those interchanged all the time.
I don't even know the difference. I'm just
Well, I hope you do. Yeah, so I'm out in the field a lot. You are too. I get a lot of people get those confused. They'll say, I want a pen test quote. And 9 times out of 10, when I start asking the questions, they're like, that's not what I want. I just want a vulnerability scan. So let's talk about the difference. What is the true difference between a vulnerability scan and a penetration test?
You're asking me?
I am asking you.
I don't even know the difference. I'm just joking. So in my mind, I mean, a vulnerability scan is just that, right? It is not passively, but it is scanning your environment for vulnerabilities, and it's going to provide you a report. A penetration test, on the other hand, is trying to exploit those vulnerabilities to gain access to the system.
Right. So an active hands-on keyboard, or could be an automated test, right?
Right.
So what are some of the most common tools that you've seen out there? You've had way more experience on this than I have. So what are some of the cool tools for vulnerability scanning that you've had experience with? Because I think everybody's familiar with the same old Rapid7, Tenable, but what else do you see?
I see a lot of Nessus. I see a lot of nothing, right, for vulnerability scanning. So Nessus is a big one. Sometimes people have that in-house. They'll do some vulnerability scanning with that. But I don't see a lot of people actually doing too much with that. Like that's really another one of those checkbox items. Are you scanning for vulnerabilities? Yep, we are scanning. Well,
it used to be, and I know we've talked a little bit about it on this show a little bit. It used to be that vulnerability scanning was this extra, almost like if I've got a bunch of extra money, I'm going to get vulnerability scanning. And years ago, I found the benefit of vulnerability scanning being confirming my patching system, right? Yeah. Because I actually ran into this very interesting scenario once, and it was probably 4 or 5 years ago. I was doing some patching inside one of our organizations, which we don't patch anymore. I don't miss that.
We don't patch.
Oh my gosh, no. So we were patching in the organization, and this organization was being audited externally. It happened all the time. They would call in a third party it was basically to audit us, right? So they wanted to make sure that their MSSP was doing effective work, so they would hire. Anyway, I got a call from the IT director one time, and he said, "Hey, our SQL server's showing a patch that's missing." And so he was like, "I thought you guys," and it was a critical one, not an important, or it was critical,
right?
So I was like, "Well, that's really bizarre because we really stay on top of that." So I went back in the patching system, and it said, "Nope, you're good. It's been delivered, and the machine accepted it." So I went back and told him that was the case, and he went back to the auditor, and they ran another scan, and he was saying, "Nope, it's still showing that it's not there." And I was like, "What in the world is going on? How are they?" And I was like, "I'm gonna get to the end of this." So I got permission to log onto the machine locally, and I hit the window, check for updates,
right.
And it gave me the green checkbox. And it said everything's been deployed. There's no patches missing.
Just superseded patch?
No, no, it wasn't. So I took a screenshot and showed him, and I was like, "It is showing that the patch is installed. There's no missing patches." And he's like, "Look, man, I don't know what's going on here, but they're saying that they ran a vulnerability scan, and they're showing that the patch is missing." And I'm like, "Oh, they ran a vulnerability scan. That's interesting." So I've got a vulnerability scanner showing that there's a missing patch, but I've got the machine itself saying that everything's fine. So I went out and got my own version of a vulnerability scanner. So I think they were using Qualys or something. I forget what they were using. And I went out and got a Tenable trial license, and I ran it against that machine, and lo and behold, it was also showing that it was vulnerable, that that critical patch was missing.
Uh-oh.
So I'm like, well, what would you do? I haven't told you the story. What would you do? How would you approach that?
I don't know. So now you have 2 vulnerability scanners saying that you're missing,
but the machine says it's fine. So who do you believe?
I don't know. I have to believe the scanners.
vulnerability scanners, right?
Yeah.
So I did too. So I'm like, all right, well, I did the inevitable. Let's call Microsoft. Nobody wants to do that.
I didn't want to say that out loud,
I
but
know.
that was my next step.
Right. Well, how many times have people called Microsoft? So I did it, right? So I called Microsoft. I
4
forget.
hours later.
Yeah, right. So I called Microsoft and I started explaining the situation, and the guy almost immediately said, "I know exactly what the problem is." And I was like, "You do?
You should have played the lottery that day.
Have you run across this before?" And he's like, "Yeah, it's actually an undocumented flaw."
Wow.
And I'm like, "An undocumented flaw? So there's no fix for this?" He's like, "No, there's no official patch because it's been seen so
few times.
few times that it didn't warrant any type of response. It was just being quietly handled as people called in." It's like, this is ridiculous. So I'm like, "So what's the flaw?" And they said, "Well, the flaw is in that current version of Windows. I think it was like Server 2018 or something. There was an issue with the patch chaining, is what he called it. So when the patches would, Microsoft at one point went from like individual patches to those roll-ups.
So cumulative updates.
Yes, and something in the cumulative update got it out of order. So it was a dependency issue, and that particular series of patches got out of order. So it wasn't actually getting installed because it was out of order and it was missing a dependency. But the flaw was the server was actually thinking that it got installed and it had ingested it and it had installed it, but it wasn't actually installed. So you got a false green light indicating that patches were installed, but in turn it wasn't. So that's a really long story, right? To reinforce, y'all need a vulnerability scanner. Because I can't tell you that never happened again, to my knowledge, right? And you've done a lot of vulnerability scanning, but it's just something to be aware of, because with all these critical updates that are happening and all these 0 days, I really, in my heart, think that the best way to verify that your patching policy and procedures are successful is to back that up with a vulnerability scanner.
Yeah, I agree. You got to definitely check, right, that your patches are taking. They're being rebooted. They're not just hanging out there just in some weird state.
Right.
We're actually moving to a more continuous vulnerability management, right? So instead of those monthly scans, you got something?
Well, I would actually have people say, they would want to scan once a year. And I was like, I really don't know the effectiveness of a vulnerability scan once a year. But the whole continuous scanning thing is really intriguing to me. So talk more about that.
Yeah, so we have a platform that we're using. It's called Connect Secure. There's agents, there's probes. There's a couple different routes you can go, but the premise is you're continually scanning your environment. Agents check in every 15 minutes. It's really providing you kind of a holistic view of your environment. It's pulling back hardware inventory, software inventory. Software inventory is really big, right? So not only are you doing Windows patches, which I feel like most people are pretty decent at. I mean, it's easy to configure Windows Update and just let it roll. But it's pulling back all of those software vulnerabilities, all the Chromes. I mean,
nice.
85 different versions of Chrome in your environment. Really difficult to patch that, right? So,
right.
But at least you know about that now. So if you see that out there, it's pulling back that inventory, then you can address those types of issues too. So there's more benefit to continuous management like that than just knowing what your missing patches are.
Right. And CIS controls, again, know your hardware, know your software, control 1 and 2.
We should just do an episode on just 1 and 2.
Yeah, I know. Right. There's a lot to that. All right. So the pen testing piece, again, I'll have people say, can I get a quote for a pen test? What kind of pen test do you need?
There's a lot of different flavors.
Like, I don't know. I just need a pen test. And it's like, well, do you need an application pen test? Like, do you have an application that wants pen tested? Do you, I just want an external pen test. And, oftentimes I would go, I don't think that's an effective use of money to just try and get an external pen test without some type of like white box inside. I don't know. So there's a lot. I guess what the audience needs to know is there's a lot that goes into the request of a pen test, right?
There's a lot of scoping that goes involved.
I guess that's what I'm trying to say, right?
There's scoping, there's timing, You just need to kind of coordinate that. It's not something you just kind of let loose on your environment. Typically, the way I run our pen tests, our external pen tests, is I run two different ones, right? I'll run a whitelisted and a non-whitelisted. Typically, I do.
What do you mean by that?
So the IPs that we scan from on the internet coming outside into your environment externally, initially I'll do that without any whitelisting. Like, don't put the IPs in there into your firewall to let it know that these are allowed IPs. And the reason I do that is really because I want to test your defenses, right?
Okay.
So it's the IDS, IPS on your firewall. Is that working? Typically, what I see is when I launch that test, IPS shuts us down pretty quick. Right? Typically,
I would hope so.
Right. That's typically a blank report.
Right.
And that's a good thing, right? So then I'll ask the client to whitelist a handful of IP addresses that we're coming from on the internet, and it bypasses those and really tests your firewall specifically, right? It's looking for, we do like vulnerability scan with that, so it'll look for vulnerabilities on your firewall, and it'll try to circumvent your firewall to get into your environment.
Yeah, and even more goes into that from a scoping perspective. Do you want the ethical hacker who is performing this, do you want them to capture something, right? Do you want them to, because really the name of the game is you're telling, there's some crown jewels on the inside, right?
Right.
And you can tell them that, right? You can tell them, yeah, I want you to bring me a record that's stored in an encrypted database, right?
Right.
Because the whole goal is to learn how they did it, right? So if they are successful, learning how they did it so that you can fix that vulnerability, you can fix that hole. And then, I think a lot of what people don't understand is that what you actually hire them to do is illegal.
Yeah, that's why we have them sign that piece of paper.
That's correct. It's called wiretapping, right? And it's a federal law. So there is kind of a get out of jail free card, right? So there's a rules of engagement, right? So you don't want to go outside of that scope.
Right. It's a scope very specifically, right? Like, we just want to know what IP blocks that we're testing, and even internally, right? I mean, these are all what I consider network pen tests, right? So internally, we try to see how we can move laterally east and west, but they're scoped very, very carefully. What subnets are we going to touch? What boxes may be in or out of scope there. All
right. Well, that's the difference between vulnerability scanning and pen testing. So we hope you learned something from this episode. Thank you for attending. We'll see you on the next episode. I'm Sean.
I'm Chad.
And this was CS Cyber.